floor is open for questions and comments on whichever pieces of it you would like. Let me ask you, as always, to identify yourself and then fire away.
Hi.
We'll get a queue going at the standing mic in the back. We've also got a traveling mic. Yeah.
Pedro da Costa from Reuters News. My question is for Carmen Reinhart. I find her analysis a little depressing.
Welcome to the crowd.
And also a little defeatist in the sense that it's tautological in a sense to say that we should do nothing to help a crisis or to help the economy get out of a crisis, because history tells us that the last time they didn't do anything about it, we didn't get out of it. So it seems like if we actually had a different approach that was more proactive, both on the monetary and fiscal side, and that was more intelligent and calibrated, that might be a more effective, and a more positive message that actually has policy prescriptions. Because for you to tell 14 million unemployed Americans that there's just nothing we can do, it's going to be that way for a while, is just not satisfactory. Thank you.
I don't think Carmen said do nothing, but let me ask her to speak for herself.
Okay.
Hit the button.
No, it's not.
I'll start with a very, very brief anecdote, but apropos. When I was 10 years old, I had a rheumatic fever and was in the hospital paralyzed. And every time they would come in, I wouldn't take oral medication, so I would get shots. And they would come in and always tell me, no, this is the last one. This is the last one. But 3 hours later, they would tell me the same thing. And I was 10 years old, and I didn't speak much English because I just arrived from Cuba. And I told them, well, look, why don't you just give it to me straight? Why don't you just tell me, is this going to continue or not? So do not confuse defeatism with realism. What can we do? We can start acting grown up. And acting grown up requires actually acknowledging that you have a debt overhang, that the odds of repayment are slim. Restructurings. Restructurings are a way of moving things forward. In the context of the U.S. real estate situation, forbearance is a delay problem. It's a problem that actually kicks the can down the road. I think, and I've talked about this in different forums, that just as for the lowest income Americans, we're going to need debt forgiveness, not unlike debt forgiveness that was applied to the HIPC, or highly indebted poorest countries, after much debate, and simply because of the fact that that's dealing with reality that the odds of repayment in certain chunks of the real estate market, the odds of repayment are very close to zero. When we had secondary market prices for emerging market debt, Chile is traded at 92 cents to the dollar and Bolivia at 10 cents to the dollar. And acknowledging that 10 cents to the dollar sooner rather than later saves time. I think the issue of denial is a big policy problem. I also think that the way of doing fiscal stimulus is predicated upon a different type of economic cycle. In 1982, at the bottom of the worst recession that we had had up to that point in time in the post-World War II, household debt was 45% of GDP. Now it is over twice that. When you add income to households that are highly indebted, I don't think the multiplier effects are going to kick in or should be expected to kick in with the same force. I think there's a debt overhang, and a lot of the incremental income is going to go to debt repayment. So why not deal with the debt issue first and foremost? So I think you confuse dealing with reality with fatalism and defeatism. I think the countries that have gotten out of the crises quicker, I mean quicker, not prettier, because often quicker is quite ugly. Because when you ask the financial industry to write down debts from, and really have something resembling mark to market, you induce fire sales. You induce a lot of turmoil. But it's a gamble of short-term instability with sharper recovery versus the very Japanese approach of more kicking the can down the road. I'll stop there.
Next question.
Thank you. Jack Goldstone, George Mason University and Brookings Institution. I commend your realism. I think it's the only way to go. And I want to ask about one factor and ask, is this included both in Mike's forecast and Carmen in your historical data? And that is the exogenous factor of labor force growth. As you know, January 1st, the baby boomers started to enter their late 60s. So I'm wondering, historically, when you're trying to recover from a financial overhang, what is the difference whether your underlying labor force is growing or has, as in Europe, started to decline? And for the return of the housing market that Mike is looking forward to, have you factored in that the fastest growing age segment for the next 20 years in the US will be the over 60 rather than the family forming household formation segment in their 20s and 30s?
Well, when people retire, they often set up separate maintenance. They move to Florida or what have you, and the family that used to be one unit becomes two units. So I'm not certain the demographic factors necessarily point in the direction of a smaller number of households. Indeed, over the post-war period, the number of households per capita has had a persistent upward trend, which was reversed during the recession as economic pressures forced the kids to move back with their parents and the grandparents to move in and so forth. I anticipate that as the economy recovers, we'll see some reversal of that, and that will be part of the increasing demand for the housing stock. No doubt the rate of population growth has slowed in the U.S. Partly its native increase has slowed, partly it's that for a variety of reasons immigration has slowed, and it remains to be seen how that will develop over time. But I'm not projecting that by the end of next year we're going to be back to 1.5 million units or the 2.2 million units per year that we were installing at the peak of the housing boom at the end of 2005. If we can get up from 550,000 to 750,000, that's about what's needed to provide the additional impetus to GDP growth from that sector that I'm anticipating over the next year. Now again, whether it will happen or not, I'm not certain. Let me just mention one other thing. Part of the adjustment process, an essential part of the adjustment process, is foreclosure, right? That's what happens when people can't pay their mortgages. The creditor takes over the property, and if the property is worth less than the value of the mortgage, well, the creditor is out, and that's the way it goes. We've been doing millions of foreclosures per year. We've not been sitting on our hands in terms of the necessary but painful adjustment that has to be ongoing in the housing sector. It's not over, but we are not Japan, who denied the problem for 5 or 6 years and made no progress at all in resolving it.
I want to address the medium-term component of that question. All the debt numbers that I showed is plain vanilla central government or federal government debt, gross debt. There is a whole class of contingent liabilities that makes the advanced economy medium-term situation far worse than the historic numbers show. The reason I show that is not because I'm not very much aware of the problem that you're raising with demographics, the demographics of aging, but that the data historically on contingent liabilities is, I certainly haven't come close to finding anything for that many countries for that long a period. But in effect, the magnitude of the debt overhang is greater than what my analysis shows, because there's the contingent liabilities of what you raise, which is the Social Security and aging population issues in the advanced economies, but there's also the issue of the contingent liabilities in the financial industry. And now Simon talked about the big issue of valuing bank assets. I mean, the sovereign debt in banks at market values, and the disaster scenario that could portray. Well, I would add to that also there's a lot of non-performing bank assets that are outside the government, private sector debts that are also if marked to market, if valued at market prices, would also show another layer of hidden debts. Contingent liabilities is what I'm getting at. That if you thought I was not uplifting before, I really actually hadn't gotten to the issue of hidden debts, but that's part of the story.
Quick questions. First from Mike, if I am reading your document correctly, are you still assuming 4% growth in the fourth quarter of this year for the United States?
No, I knocked that back a little bit.
Okay.
The ending of expenses
Okay.
previously scheduled pushed investment first quarter of next year into the fourth quarter of this year. That does not have to be extended, and we're not going to get that shift between which does affect the fourth quarter number.
And then the second question, I guess, is for anyone, which is longer-term productivity impact, at least on a per capita basis, of a protracted period of decline in the employment to population ratio, which we've experienced, and people losing their work skills, and a sort of hysteresis effect. Are you worried that basically we're going to potentially lose 5% of the population from having an attachment to the workforce, and that will have a longer-term productivity impact?
5%, I think, is too much. I think the evidence does show that people do lose attachment to the labor force. On the other hand, we've also seen, they now finally break it out in the labor data, that people over 65, their labor force participation rate has gone up a little bit. So people who are otherwise going to be retired decided, well, my retirement funding won't quite permit that, so I'm going to work a little longer so long as I can. But I think there is an effect from a prolonged downturn, a prolonged period of high unemployment that does reduce the available labor input on a more sustained basis. Now, a third of the jobs we've lost are in construction, and they're not all coming back in that sector. So there's going to need to be a readjustment, reallocation, which is not going to be painless or quick to achieve within the U.S. Labor market. So that is going to hamper the growth of the U.S. economy going forward. But I think of that in terms of a couple of tenths of a percentage point off of the potential growth rate, not a percentage point.
Peter, I would just add that the decade after a severe crisis looks bad, but countries do recover. I mean, Japan in that regard, and we have in our sample many, many very severe crises, many, many protracted crises, but they do recover. So the issue of permanent is, you know, and there's, so I'll go as far as a decade.
Barry Wood, RTHK. From all three presentations, there seem to be nuggets suggesting that you see that inflation over, say, 5 years out may be a greater problem than deflation. Is that the case?
Well, inflation over a 5-year horizon is very much something that central banks can control. And not precisely, but they can have a great deal of influence on it. I have yet to see that evidence that the Federal Reserve or the ECB or the Bank of England Bank of England may be a little more questionable, but certainly those central banks, Bank of Japan, National Bank of Switzerland, and the Swedish Riksbank and so forth, have gone inflationist. I don't say it can't happen, and there are pressures in that direction, but I think one of the important barriers to it is that I believe there is now much greater common understanding, not only in the economics profession, but also more generally, that identifies substantial increases and sustained increases in inflation with a failure of monetary policy, and will hold central banks accountable if the inflation rate picks up on a sustained basis. So I think there is important protection in that regard, not only from the attitude of present central bankers, but from the public sector environment of which central banks are a part.
I disagree. Right now, let's say erring on the side of ease makes enormous sense. Enormous. You have an unemployment problem. That is serious. You have a private debt overhang. That is serious. If you go back to Irving Fisher's debt deflation theory of the 30s, his description of the 30s was a problem that made the Depression worse was very high real interest rates. So there are fundamental reasons having to do with the conditions of employment and the conditions of private debt, without getting into the public debt, that I think induce erring on the side of ease for justifiable reasons. But I will say that that is observationally equivalent also to being very accommodative towards very high levels of public debt. So the justification may be quite legitimately grounded on employment and private debt overhangs and concerns about creating further insolvencies. But over the long haul, I do think that the weight attached to inflation is going to be, my view is going to be lower in the next decade than in the decade that preceded the financial crisis, and I would say that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Just speaking about Europe, I think it's hard for them to find a way out without inflation. There isn't that much fiscal space to absorb the losses or to transfer the losses. There are repression type scenarios that Carmen has outlined, but those I think also tend to break down. That's why I think there is already an intense fight for control of the hearts and minds of the European Central Bank. As Mike said, it's about the norms and the values, and depending on how you count the votes, there is a shift in Europe towards, or the European Central Bank will soon have a majority of the votes in the hands of countries that one would presume to favor accommodative policy rather than restrictive policy. So I think that's what's going to happen in Europe.
I want to return to this for a moment, that we did not relive the Great Depression. Central banks learned something from that experience about what not to do in a steep recession in order to convert it into a depression. I think we've learned something on the inflation front as well. So the assumption that the future will be like the past in that regard is, I think, not entirely justified. I think there's much better understanding of how the inflationary process works, as I say, in the general public, and I think that that's a very valuable constraint on people going off the reservation too far.
We're at our witching hour, but this is obviously crucial stuff, so I'll let it go a little longer. Ian?
Yes, Carmen, if I understood you correctly...
Please identify.
Ian Talley, Dow Jones. If I understood you correctly, you said 8% of the countries that you looked historically were in the 90% and above debt to GDP bracket. I'm wondering, first of all, what is the percent of those 8% who defaulted? And then secondly, if we have the continuing transfer of debt from the private sector to the public sector in Europe, and we already have the debt overhang problem, with the debt to GDP ratios continuing to rise, whose responsibility is it to step in and if we already missed that that timing to step in and stem that transfer of responsibility from the private sector to the public.
Of the 8% of observations that were above 90, that particular number is for 21 advanced economies since World War II, that 8%, not for the broader sample of 66 countries over 200 years. And of that 8% of observations of 21 advanced economies for 1945 through 2009, in which the analysis ended, none defaulted, because those high debt ratios include Japan, include Italy, include Belgium, include Ireland in the 80s, include Greece, and so those were not high debt episodes that ended in default, but nonetheless, those were episodes that were associated with subpar or below median growth during that period. In other words, the point being, that debt was associated with lower growth absent having had a default, without having had a default.
Okay, Antoine, you get the last question.
Antoine van Akma, a question for Michael, but perhaps for all of you. If you're looking at your scenario and assume that Chinese growth will not be 9%, but trending, let's say, over the decade to 6%, and that Indian growth will not be 8%, but trending over the decade to somewhere around 7%. In addition to the withdrawal pangs that we clearly have in the advanced world, how would that change the overall scenario?
Well, clearly at the world level, since China's GDP on the PPP basis is 12% of the world total, if you knock 2 percentage points off the growth rate, it pulls down the world average by a little more than 0.2%. India is smaller and so forth. Beyond the arithmetic average, there's probably going to be some initial causative effect on slower growth in partner countries, particularly in Asia. Some of it will spill over to us and the Europeans as well. But it's obviously primarily relevant to the Chinese. Now, Nick Lardy is not part of our panel today, but I think Nick Lardy's assessment continues to be that something like 8% growth is sustainable for the Chinese economy, at least for the next decade and probably two. The pattern of growth, as I note in my paper, does need to shift more in the direction of having consumption grow, because we've already got fixed investment at almost 50% of GDP, so further growth in that share does not make a great deal of sense. And China cannot really return to improving net exports as a significant contributor to its growth rate on average over the next 5 or 10 years, as it did for a while in the preceding decade.
Okay, let me bring this to a close. Thank very much Mike, Carmen, and Simon. I must say, vis-a-vis Mike, it's quite an assignment to ask somebody to get up in front of an audience like this every 6 months, forecast the future, and be reminded, and in fact remind you himself of what he said last time and where it was right and where it was wrong. Mike's done a manful job on that over the last 10 years. I want to thank him particularly. Carmen and Simon have added to the picture enormously. I thank them. I thank all of you for coming.